Hello.
Hello, hi Katie.
Hi, Mick. So we're here with lovely Dr. Mick Collins today, who I'm so grateful for joining the campaign. And Mick, you were a university lecturer,
Yeah,
and
that's
you
right.
are author of The Unselfish Spirit. Um,
Correct.
and all of your work has been related to your own experience of spiritual emergence process. And I just really appreciate you being part of this to kind of give the academic kind of stance as well. And I know that you have a really great balance of personal experience and kind of theoretical learning around this. So thank you
Thank you.
for agreeing to be part of this and
Well, it's a
share with
pleasure.
everybody.
It's a pleasure. I mean, it's a subject that's very close to my heart in terms of, cultural change. And I think the work you're doing is incredible. And I think it's about, enabling people from all walks of life to come forward and speak about what's happened to them and kind of like what the contributions we can all make to a kind of a bit of an improved future, because actually I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of good comes out of this awakening.
Absolutely. I mean, we were just talking when before we started to record about kind of your process of actually you were in the closet for quite a long time because you had your awakening some years ago before even Groff had written about it. So if
Yeah, my
a bit
memory is,
about what that was like to kind of
yeah,
experience that and not have
yeah.
any kind of framework to understand what was happening in.
Exactly. I mean, Stan Groff, I think, wrote a paper in 1987 on this. It was a paper, and his book came out, Spiritual Emergency, in 1989. And by then, I'd gone through mine. I had an awakening in 86 when, after living in a Buddhist monastery and doing sort of, quite deep meditation processes. Not the full Monty. I didn't take on all the high tantras. I just did a very low level practice because that's my way. But it was a high level awakening with a low level practice, and yeah, it kind of really catalyzed something in me. An incredibly beautiful experience when it first opened, and I was in 2 days of bliss. It was absolute, like a full body orgasmic experience. It was
Mm,
just incredible, and I thought, what is happening?
mm,
In fact, it was probably get to the point where it got too intense, but then it was just like, wow. Everything looked sacred, people looked sacred, I was full of love, and it was an amazing experience. Then it started to slip down, and I've always questioned, well, that's what took me on a journey of self-awareness and discovery after I'd got through the experience, because it's a little bit like, I'll say a little bit like my ego was quite fragile, and when you
mm.
have a powerful experience like that, it couldn't hold it. But there's one thing that happened, is that it's more like the experience was so powerful, it eclipsed the ego, which means it didn't knock the ego out of function completely, but the ego was then in the background, while the process, all the stuff from the unconscious that came up, was in the foreground. So that 2-day beautiful experience opened me up, but because I didn't have a strong enough ego structure to integrate it,
Mm.
it eclipsed the ego, and then I was in pretty much the unconscious just coming up willy-nilly. And to be quite honest with you, I mean, I was hanging on for a couple of years, about the best part of 2 years, to get through that process, with just all my repressed shadow experiences coming up, really quite horrible impulses, violent thoughts, extreme emotions, panic,
Mm.
all flooding up, and I had no sense of how to get through it. So yes, there was no map.
Mm. Can
Or,
I just ask you a question, Mick? Because I think something that you raised there is so important, and this has come up kind of time and time again with stuff I've read and people I've spoken to and research. You mentioned that you didn't go into deep kind of meditative practice, and that you had like a not strong sense of self or ego structure. Which is that why you think that you were kind of shattered more easily? And
yes,
do you
I think
think it's more likely for people to have a quick awakening or an easier shattering when they have trauma in childhood or kind of a less structured sense of self in early age?
I mean, I think it's a great question, and to be honest, I don't think anyone can give the complete answer that covers every permutation, because psychically, psychologically, we're very complex human beings. However, I think for people who've had a relatively straightforward upbringing, who've been nurtured and loved and cared for in a way that creates a sort of an ego that can adjust and accommodate different experiences. And as Jung would say, there's an ego self with a capital S encounter. So you can start to absorb elements of the unconscious and integrate it. So it becomes not an eclipse. I think when you're absolutely right, in my case, I had a lot of fracture lines in my experience, and I had a lot of repressed shadow material, which for various reasons in childhood happened, and that suppression and that poorly adjusted ego structure, for various reasons, the way I was socialized, and not so much socialized by anyone, but my circumstances. I was jumping around from place to place because my parents were moving all the time, so no stable structures really. I was also adopted. There was a lot going on that actually meant I was a bit like easily blown in the wind. So when that experience did come up, you're absolutely right. There was a fracturing and an eclipse. So what fragments of the ego that were sort of trying to function to work through the experience were still there. So I was realizing there were some elements of me that was able to manage bits of my experience. And so, right, I'm going to get up this morning, I'm going to have a bite to eat. There's no food in the house, I'll have to go to the shops. I was able to do that, but what was raging in me was almost barely containable. And there were times when I had to lock myself away and just cut myself off from lots of different people because I was in a really extreme state.
So you were never hospitalized, were you, or labeled? No. So how did you manage to get through that without kind of going down that road?
I was, I mean, to put no finer point on it, I mean, to show the level of distress when all that shadow material come up, which is that's the map I've got for it now, that the unconscious just flew up. I was also having Kundalini-like experiences, heat in around the stomach, very subtle vibrations. I was also seeing light and color around, little small balls of light around people's heads and what have you. And so all sorts of things were kicking off, but this raging shadow stuff was coming up as well. And I think there was something about that was overwhelming. But where I was very lucky, a psychologist who had been formerly a monk, he was in his 60s, in the 80s, had been a monk in India, a sort of a mendicant wandering around India. He'd been very close working with Krishnamurti, and a real knowledgeable person. He knew a lot about Jung and all sorts of manner of stuff. And he'd heard that I was going through this experience and somehow got a message to me, because like in those days, there was no mobile phones and internet. I didn't even have a phone in the house I was living in. So I can't even remember how it happened, but a message came, Arvind, wants to be in touch. And somehow I got in touch with him. I was in North Wales. He lived in Shropshire. It wasn't too far. And I spent the weekend with him. And over the 2 and a bit years that I saw him 3 times, and he gave me a gift, an absolute gift, because he said he recognized what was happening. He said, Mick, if you can tolerate this, you're having an awakening, and you're going to have to, this is going to be something you're going to have to go through. So he taught me the idea of Krishnamurti's choiceless awareness, and I just used that. But more importantly, it wasn't just that I was thinking, just let it pass, let it pass. And when you're doing that for 2 years, let it pass, you think, is this ever going to end? I thought I was evil. How the heck I managed to contain that, I don't know. But his words, not only his words of just see yourself through this process as best you can, but the fact that he didn't run out the room screaming when I told him what I was going through,
or medicate you, or try to change it, or tell you there's something wrong with you.
He wouldn't have had the opportunity to do that, because he wasn't doing it in in a capacity to be able to give that.
No, but I'm just kind of referring to like the research, and what you say is exactly, I mean, it shows how powerful and profound experiences you can be having, but that they can be managed. And this is the difference, and this is the whole point of the campaign, isn't it? To say, okay, we're trying to prove that the research says somebody just needs validation. They need to know that the process they're going through is real, it's actually happening, and it's okay, it comes to an end. And that's sometimes all that somebody needs, actually, to get them through. And that's exactly what you seem to be saying.
Well, that's right. And I think that his kindness was something that was really key for me, because actually being validated is one thing, but to be in a space with somebody who's just looking at you with genuine care and compassion and kindness, who isn't saying, I think you're ill or sick, who's saying, treat this really carefully, but actually you're going to have to go through it. The only way is through, essentially. And I just sat there and I thought, wow. And, I've always been a fairly strong character. I've also been a very weak character as well. I think I've got a bit of both, but the part of me that's a bit resilient and giving it a go, even though my ego was eclipsed and fractured, what was left had enough oomph in the tank to really just think, I'm just going to doggedly get on with this. And I did it strategically as well, because in the 80s, these conversations weren't happening in everyday mainstream society. So I had to be quite wily as well, and just right, I'm going to have to just take care of myself and be very careful about who I talk to, because it won't be understood.
Yeah, and that's the exact thing that I really hope that this can change, because it causes so much, suffering for people when you have to do that, doesn't it? I mean, your crisis was probably extended for that reason.
Well, it was, like I say, the epicenter of what was a beautiful awakening. Ended up becoming 2 years of just sheer, I mean, there was very little lightness in it. It was pretty heavy. But, having Arvind just give me that little bit of a nudge, not pushing me along, but saying, you can do this, you can do this. I mean, I had to go through it, obviously alone, but yeah, I mean, it just is incredible to be given that level of, trust.
Trust in the process. Would you mind just sharing a little bit about what that darkness entailed for you? Like, what did it look like, either the energies that you're experiencing or visions or whatever it might have been?
I mean, it was absolutely dreadful in the true sense of the word. I mean, the word dread is often linked to the numinous. The numinous is like a spirit, or it was the sort of Rudolf Otto, a theologian who went around the world looking at what the numinous, the spirit, meant to every different culture. He said it seems to have two poles, something which is quite beautiful and quintessential and beatific and sweetness and light, and then got this dreadful, awful component which is full of temper and really tricky, difficult stuff. And I felt I'd had both. I had this momentary lift and sinking into what I call a grisly horror, really. And it was, like I said, that I felt it wasn't just that I was having a few bad thoughts. I was feeling everything that was coming up in me. And there were some very unpleasant thoughts and feelings that were like quite violent, quite self-loathing, and so that level of self-destruction potential was there, and that touched into a very powerful fault line of really, not feeling very good about myself as a human being. So even when you're trying to get through a process and trusting in yourself, when you've got that level of self-disgust and that level of thinking that you're possessed by evil because of all the things that are coming up in you, really unpleasant. I learnt after studying a little bit of Jung and doing training and some psychotherapy training, I learned that actually I'd been a bit possessed by the unconscious. I wasn't possessed by anything other than what hadn't been resolved in me.
Yeah.
So it was an absolute, and that healing journey has taken years and is still carrying on today. It's not like I'm done. It's not done. I still feel like I'm being done.
Yeah.
And I'm working through it. And,
we're never done, are we? That's what I really respect about you, Mick. And, you've done incredible work. You've done some, worked as a lecturer, kind of subtly introducing students to this subject, I know, for many years. And I know a lot of your students have done PhDs about spiritual crisis, haven't they? And, written books.
Yeah, not my students per se, but I've contributed to, some thoughts of, one person who's doing a PhD on spiritual crisis, that's for sure. And I've put some thoughts into that. But I've actually taken people through, how can I put it, master's dissertations and Bachelor of Science dissertations focused on spirituality. I've done quite a few of those. And spiritual emergency pops in every now and again because there's a paper or two. And I've never gone full on trying to just, putting lots of all the emphasis on that. I try to, if I teach spirituality, I teach it, well, here it is in its everyday form, and this is what we know about it. This is the research. And there is also experiences of spiritual crisis. And of course, some people have got interested in that and gone and looked up on the net, and they found one or two papers I've written. And I thought, so, in a way, it's been a bit like bringing that forward, not in a way of being like a social activist that's right out there, but very subtly just saying, you know what, this is really interesting. And it's part of, if we're going to be looking at spirituality, then we've got to understand spiritual emergency. So there's a book that came out this year, Spirituality Across 20 Different Professions. And I wrote a chapter in that book and I included spiritual emergency in it. So, which is nice, but in the context of the whole picture, because it is a part of the process.
Yeah.
So, for me, it's about, that's what I feel I've been trying to do, is to link it together and saying, if we're looking at spirituality, we have to understand that actually things can open up quite strongly. And then we need to think about what that means for how we help people.
Do you think, Mick, that the more open society becomes to this, and the more people kind of have a framework to understand their experiences, that the less people will go into crisis and the more people will just kind of gradually have an unfolding, an awakening? Because
that's a really good question, isn't it? And crumbs, I wish I had my crystal ball here to look at that. It's a great question.
You've got one.
Well, let's have a look. I don't know, but do you know what I do think? I think it's like that critical mass. When more people can talk about something, and then let's say I'm the person that's going through the spiritual crisis, and let's say we're in a place where we're talking about spirituality. If spiritual emergency or spiritual crisis is not on the menu, I'll be a bit slightly anxious and I'll repress this part of the conversation, and in a way it will just amplify the distress.
Yeah.
However, if everyone in that room was saying, oh wow, so there's another element to this too, and you're welcome to bring forward some experiences, I think you're right. I think that does create something that makes it easier. But I do think too, I don't think you can bypass, if that suppressed material, shadow material, and that breakthrough materials in you, then there is, then you're probably going to have to go through.
No way out but through.
Yeah.
And I love the conversations that we've had, because we used to meet up, didn't we, for coffee and talk about all this, and it's you've been such an eye-opener for me, and a really great source of information.
Well, to be honest, I think it goes two ways. I get a lot from the conversation too, because we were talking about rank, and for me, when people's experiences, people's social activism. You've got an enormous amount of rank that brings something forward as a leader, and that's great. But I think everybody's got rank somewhere. I trained with Arnold Mindell and Amy Mindell and colleagues, and they're very big on that you know, everybody's got rank, everyone's got something that they can contribute, and I just feel very pleased to contribute what I have, you know.
I think, yeah, it's all part of that kind of, we're bringing community back, aren't we? That's kind of what's happening within mental health as well. And it's like we're going back to what the old tribal cultures, systems, and where there isn't rank and everybody supports everybody else. And it just feels like a much healthier way of living.
Yeah, you're right. And you know, I just want to bring one more thing in, but because you asked that question, I've just had a thought. You asked that question about what do I think about if we have a more open society, more people are able to talk about the spiritual crisis, will it make it easier for the others? Well, I gave my answer on that, and I think that's a reasonable take on it. I also think that we're in a world that's growing in crisis. And actually, I mean, I wrote a paper in, gosh, I can't 7 years ago or something like that, where myself and a couple of Jungians, we sort of like looked at mapping out that actually if the world, which is our, if you wish, our spiritual home, it's our life support system, becomes more and more diminished and we can't live on it, i.e. because water tables are going down, food resources and energy resources are being diminished, and we've got an atmosphere that's in crisis, the natural thing is, because our spiritual home's in crisis, it will induce probably more crisis. So in some way, I don't see any way out of this. I mean, I wish it wasn't going to be like that. And I can't say it will be. But logically, if you think about it, a world that's spinning into a bit of a crisis mode with more and more people living on the planet, overpopulation, pressure on resources, and we wake up to what we've done, we might find more people need the sort of help that we're speaking about. So then it's about, right, this could be part of a great awakening.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have that sense. It's like that whole paradox, isn't it? It's like this new paradigm, and there's more crises which are happening because we're projecting the shadow out, which is causing more crisis, but that's causing more people to wake up and go through the crisis. So they're kind of, they're emerging and coming into the light and creating, that's the way of creating heaven on earth, isn't it? It's like through the crisis almost. So
I mean, so in a way, in some kind of way, the flip, if it's happening, and I believe it is happening, that you will get people having gentle wake-ups, and well, great, well done. And I'm so pleased, because you know, you don't want people to go through the mess, but then of course there will be those of us that go through these more painful crises, more painful awakening. And of course then, if it becomes something like a more global phenomenon, then I think, you know, I would be really fascinated if the World Health Organization would really get onto this. I'd love it if...
I've got shivers.
Yeah, well, you see, because then, I mean, I've thought about this a lot over the years, obviously being a health professional and being a formal health academic, I've thought about that question as a public health issue.
It's huge, isn't it? It's huge. And it's, you know, I know I do this a lot lightheartedly, but it's a really serious issue. And I want this to create a movement and, you know, ideally a political transformation. And it could save the health system billions, you know, if people are being correctly supported to journey through in their own way like you did, without needing the systems and the pharmaceuticals, then we're talking about massive savings as well.
It could have, if we're enabling sort of people that are going through spiritual crisis, spiritual emergency, to get that sort of support to go through the process. And of course, you know, I mean, it's like anything. I don't want to badmouth the system, because the system is what it is. And, you know, I respect it. I'm part of it. I've worked in it. So I train people in it. So I am the system. What can I say? But I also think it has its own evolution to wake up. And we're part of that. So it's our health service. And we have professionals working in it to enable us. I'm one of them. And what I'd love to see is that, because I think great work does happen there's people with amazingly good hearts,
Yeah.
and there's
Yeah.
amazing politicians that want to do the right thing for people. And of course, what we'd love is a system that really understood, these spiritual crises. And, I'd love to see more effort and more resources put to that. But of course, there will be people that need medication, will need some, if you're going to worry about harming others or harming yourself, then, have some help and some boundaries around that, so that then that can come forward later on. I've got no problem with that. What sort of worries me a little bit, though, is that currently the movements towards growth of the transpersonal, the spiritual that we're talking about, they're there, but they're slow. And I just would think the rate and pace of the crises in the world at the moment, for me, is that we need probably more resources going into mental health to then look at this as a public health issue that we're talking about. But that's just my quiet thoughts about the subject,
Mm-hmm. Well, Mick, I'm maybe not so quiet and impatient, so which is why this is happening, really. But
I remember, me too. I always go for the slow burn. I tend to be, one of those people that I like the fuse, and I'll probably go for 40, 50, 60 years slow fuse, and it's great. We need all sorts, don't we?
Absolutely.
But I remember that one of my teachers somewhere said, and I never forgot that, and that when you're working with society and social activism and change, because systems take a while to change, naturally they do. Systems are slow to change. It's not because people don't want to change. It's just that putting in policies, procedures, and process and training, that takes time. And for the fireball activists, the real danger point is burning out, because if the system doesn't change as quick as you are wishing it to, that's the fast track for burnout. So I've always remembered, right, pull back, Collins, light your fuse and just do your work. I'm a bit like that, but I also think there's times for things to fizz a bit quickly as well.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good message for me. I mean, my wrinkles have expanded just doing this campaign. So,
but one thing I would say, where I'm going to pick myself up now, is my slow burn can be pretty intense. I mean, I'm working on a new book, and I will write for 10, 11 hours a day, and I will almost, that's almost in a way not good for me. So, I can't help it. I get a little bit sort of, but that process is long term for me. But actually, my process, the process of my slow burn fuse is quite intense.
Well, you channel as well, don't you? So when you're writing your books, it's kind of, I know you get in the flow and it all comes through as well. So.
I work on myself as I'm writing the book.
Yeah.
And every time I do a book like this, I do lots of exercises at the end of the chapters, and I test them on myself to see where they take me.
Wow.
So it's quite demanding.
Well, and that brings us to the fact that you have to be the change you wish to see in the world, don't you? It's like you have to do that work on yourself, else nothing is going to shift. No,
and then it's about actually being a somebody that is a compassionate to all sides. I sort of think, like, there's no good bashing the system on the head and saying you're all wrong and getting it wrong, but actually work with the system, inspire change and invite change, and be the change. And people think, God, you know what? We could use a few of those ideas. And you see it with mindfulness. Now, I did a little pilot, little research in 1989 on mindfulness in Norwich amongst all the GPs. In 1989.
Wow.
Was it 1989 or 1990? I did a little survey on GPs in Norwich, and one of them thought it was a good idea. But at the time, there was a lot of people that had been in the system a while and didn't quite cotton onto it. And they weren't against it. They're saying, well, it's very good, but, not sure about that.
Yeah.
But look at that now.
17 years later.
And then you just think, whoa, actually, it's a radical shift, because it's now being...
27 years later.
27 years. So you take that 27 years, and it's a radical sea change now.
I think, and I think, you're right. I mean, I think we're gonna. this is happening quite quickly now, isn't it? And I think we're going to see massive changes in the next 10 years or so.
Well,
I hope.
We'll have to, because I think the way the world's going, and because of the intensity of what it is to live and to be, and in this time, it's going to, we're going to need to shift something to meet it. Mm. And of course, those will bring up the fault lines. And this is what spiritual crisis is. Yeah. And I think actually the smart thing is to actually start to work out how we can flow with it and learn from it as a society. So these conversations that you're having with all the people that you're drawing in, I think are brilliant, because they are a template that there's all these different people in the world that have had these experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, working with ISEN, we're kind of seeing thousands and thousands of people around the world explaining similar things. Now, that's not coincidence, is it? No. And I'm hoping that, you know, the more spectrum we can show through this campaign, the more voices that we have, the more people it will speak to. So I really appreciate you being part of this, Mick. And I know we're going to have another couple of interviews, because I'm really excited to learn more about your new book and
Thank you.
To share that with people.
One of the thoughts I want to say is, as well, you talk about synchronicity. I'd love to just share my I Ching story. Can I?
Oh, please.
Right. Okay. So, you know, sometimes you said, oh, it's like all these people around the world drawing stuff in, and I think there will be synchronicities with people trying to connect with like-minded souls that are doing this work. Yeah. And you know, one of the things that really I've loved Jung for many years, and you know, it was his work and Mindell and Groff, Christina and Stan Groff and others that helped me enormously to get a fix for how I went forward after the crisis, and you know, and carry on working. But in the process, right in the middle of the crisis, I did the I Ching, because I didn't have anyone to really consult. So I consulted a book of divination. The I Ching is a very ancient text, and it doesn't give you answers. It's about reflection. And you shake 3 coins 6 times, and you'll get heads and tails combinations every time you shake the coins. Well, I got 3 heads 6 times, which mathematically is pretty hard to get. If you bet somebody £10 million they'd get that in that throw, you probably wouldn't get it. Some 10 million people might, I don't know, the 10th million person. But anyway, I got it. And I asked the question about, how am I going to get through this? Because I was in a desperate state, and I just wanted to reflect with a book of divination. It's a very, to me, quite a sacred book. It's Taoism, so it's natural nature of wisdom. And I opened up the reading, and 3 heads 6 times gives you a hexagram, which is a diagram, and it then gives you a page number you go to. And I looked at it, and I've got page 1 and reading number 1, which is creativity. And it is about that sort of being creative in how you meet life and the Tao. And then, because it had all moving lines, which I won't explain too much, it went to receptivity, number 2. So it was the perfect teaching for be creative and be receptive. And, you know, I took that in whatever way I could, in the way I went forward. And it was an amazing synchronicity. So I was very touched by that, because that book was another thing that reading totally got me through. And I've kept a record of that. I've used that book since 1984, and I've kept a record of every time I've used it, because I'm a bit meticulous like that. And I've never had that since.
Wow. It's really interesting, isn't it, Mick? Because it's such an individual journey in those sort of ways. We all get messages that really speak to us that probably wouldn't mean anything to anybody else. But when you can really connect with something like that, and it empowers you to kind of move forward yourself. It doesn't matter what it is. It really, that's the whole point, isn't it? It doesn't matter as long as it's meaningful for you.
Exactly. And if it facilitates that next step for you, and that you can, you know, for me, it's always about the next step is like, how do I integrate this? How can I move forward and start to integrate? And because I look at that, if this awakening's something, it might fragment, and it might show the fault lines in your ego and other shadowy aspects that you hadn't looked at, but it's about a journey into wholeness. And you know, like I said, for me, 30 odd years on, I'm still on that journey of wholeness, you know, and there's moments where I completely wobble, and I still have to work on it. So
Yeah.
For me, the integration is so you do the I Ching like that. That was a moment of wholeness. How do you take yourself from creativity, and how can you be receptive to your own needs and how you're looking at blending in with society? And it was a really good reading. I just thought, wow.
One last thing, Mick, before we finish today, because I know
Yeah.
we're gonna kind of, hopefully have a few more conversations. But when you describe that feeling of wholeness, and it's like, in those moments, that's one of those kind of moments. How would you describe it? How do you know?
Yeah, it's a good one, isn't it? Because I suppose it is that tacit knowing that you know it by knowing it.
Yeah.
And yet, for me, where I felt it then would be, when I was working through this process, there were some nice little bits that came out. There was a book by Ed Podvall, I believe, in 1990 called The Windhorse Project.
Yeah.
Sorry, not The Windhorse Project. And the book was called, I can't remember what the book was called now. But I remember devouring
I know The Windhorse Project.
Yeah. Well, I got that book because I was, again, although it was 1990, I was only sort of 4 years through, the process. So it's still a bit raw. And I read that process, and Podvall spoke about islands of clarity in your experience. And so for me, there were islands of clarity where I felt momentary wholeness. I don't think I was fully whole because I was still shot away and fragmented, but I had an island of clarity, and it was a moment of wholeness, and I held to that. And what I felt then was that the levels of disturbance were less at that time, and that there was a body relationship. I felt connected to the body, and you could breathe, and you could sense your place in the world. And then it would go away again, and that island of clarity had gone. But I think, in a way, for me, it's been about joining up those experiences so they become more connected over time, and then the fragmentation begins to.
Yeah, I was just thinking that as you were explaining, it's like the fragments are almost coming back into body when we shatter. Like bit by bit, they kind of come back and drop into place.
And of course, again, where I love Jung, because he says, we all have complexes, and the complex is like something that operates in us. And so, for instance, when I had the spiritual crisis, all those complexes came up, or were described. And, but what he said is, you don't always get over a complex, you just get better at knowing what they are. And actually, for me, that was such a big thing, because I met someone in Norwich who's now passed away, but he was a Chan Buddhist scholar, Richard Hun, and a philosopher. And we spoke a lot about Jung. He went out to Switzerland and interviewed Marie-Louise von France before she died. And he was a real, genuine, sort of good person. And, we would often have these sorts of conversations, and it really touched me that actually you think, you don't always get over them, but you get better at knowing them. Yeah. And then you can be in your wholeness, even where you might have bits that are a bit wobbly.
You can choose to. This is how I love how this movement is kind of integrating and overlapping with like the Hearing Voices Network and that kind of brilliant work that they do. It's like you still know the voice is there. You just choose not to. Or you kind of love it into wholeness, or you choose to be conscious of it but not to relate to it, or to let it overtake you. So it's people say the same things in very different ways, don't they? And
I mean, if it's just something about I think one of the things that I learned from Ed Podwell's work, and I think again, another early on pioneer was, and Jung said this, when stuff comes up, try not to panic. Because I think when the panic comes in, that floods sort of some flammables onto what is already a distress. So it's about, that may not happen every time. And of course, I was caught by panic all the time. But, one of the things I learned was actually gradually that you can just start to think, right, it's that. And you don't panic when you and then suddenly you're facilitating yourself into a state where you might not feel whole, but you're heading that way, and you have those islands of clarity.
Yeah. This is a brilliant segue into your next interview, because
is it? Great.
because I'm just thinking about because I love this. I'm really fascinated with like the shadow and criminal minds and that kind of stuff. And I'm just thinking about how you mentioned, you had violent thoughts coming up and stuff, and actually you can learn not to connect with those thoughts, because we all have them. We're all human. It's part of being human. Exactly. And it's when you push them away and become very scared of them, or you actually just relate to them completely and think that's who you are, that's when people can kind of trip into the criminal world or whatever it might be. So, and I know you're writing about all of this, so
yeah, I'm having a go at it. It's it's a big job. I mean, but I'm having a shot at it. But at the same time, I think it's about like just not making something like it becomes so big that you're creating something that is bigger than it should be, and at the same time not identifying with it, so that you then get lost in it.
Yeah.
Because both of those can be quite extreme. But it's about how do you just think to yourself, well, here's a part of the experience right now, and it doesn't define me. And, I am not it.
Yeah.
But actually, how can I now have the courage to be through this? And if you need help, I think ask for help, get some. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, everyone's capacity to deal with what they get, and everyone's process is different, and everyone's got, two people are the same. So, I don't see any shame in getting help.
It's about making those things acceptable to talk about, isn't it? That's the thing, rather than keeping them oppressed inside. If we can create a society where it's okay to admit those things and to talk about it without being sectioned or put away in prison or whatever it might be, then we're creating a better world, and less shame. And
exactly. And of course, I mean, if I flip back to when I've worked in the system, part of where the system has to work with people is if they have the capacity to think, well, actually, can you work with that? Can you hold that? And if people can't, and they're being pulled away, then that's when that
interventions,
duty of care to try and take care. I hate it when it goes into a thing that gets quite awful for people. But I often look at the intention, which is to try and help someone from themselves or from hurting others. And, so there is that element in there in society. But, I mean, I think what I'd love to see is a more psychological mindedness with our spiritual development, how we can sort of, and it doesn't then just come to when it gets to crisis. I would like to go back. Let's just think about how we start educating children about what it is. About who we are. And they're already doing mindfulness in schools, for instance, which is great. So then, sometimes we get difficult thoughts, and sometimes we have difficult experiences.
It's what they're teaching with the mindfulness, isn't it? Because if they're talking about the emotions that are coming up or the thoughts that are coming up, then great. I just hope that that's happening.
Yeah, I think, again, I think you're actually bang on that this is a cultural-wide phenomenon. And maybe the reason this is happening, the good work that you're doing, and I know others are doing, to take that message out there, is about how we harness this and really start to evolve together, and about, what are the checks and balances? What are the safety points? Where's the care in the, so that everyone's looked after, so that we don't just assume, because some people might need that extra help, and other people might need that help to go forward, and others might need some help just to, contain something, which is difficult. So I guess it's like, as long as we've got a continuum, at the moment we've got the
one or the other
but we're still now looking at how we can develop forward. And I think the work is happening, but there doesn't seem to be at the moment a guiding vision for it. And then maybe that's what we need, that how do we bring people forward together to work with things that are disturbing, but as growth potential.
Yes.
That's what I'd love to see.
Absolutely.
And I think we can do it because it's been done. We can do it, but I think it's going to take a lot of effort and a shift in our structures. So obviously education, politics, health. But this is where it begins.
And a lot of voices, a lot of people daring to speak out like you have, and sharing, your truth, your authenticity. So grateful for that, Mick.
Well, thank you.
So
pleasure to do it.
Until next time. We'll
Yeah,
meet again.
we will. Should we do a Vera? Vera Lynn, we'll meet again.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
I'm not singing. No one
No,
wants
nor am
that. Okay. Thank you,
I.
Mick.
Good to speak.
Really appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Katie.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.